The next system we're going to talk about are more the subsystems of the pyramid, as in we've spoken about the main systems, which really sort of are the fundamental systems of gathering energy and the sort of real powerful stuff, but we're talking now about the subsystems which further amplify it, make it oscillate, and basically get the thing to work. You know, the subsystems which are involved, like in having the whole thing do a function rather than just accumulate energy, which we've spoken about energy accumulation. This is about the oscillatory system, the function, and sort of the finer details within those systems. So basically, I'm going to start by illustrating that there are three main systems, oscillators in the pyramid, which all have to be lined up and synchronized for it to work. And the first one being the dominant of the both is the Quartz Oscillator, which is a quartz crystal which looks like a teardrop, a small crystal which is in the path of the waves from the lower and upper reflector. So the quartz crystal is one. There's the electrical oscillator, which is literally just the rings and the coils which actually form an oscillator, because they're wired like one. You have your capacitor and your coils, which the capacitor is formed because of the gap and the capacitance between the two rings, the alpha and omega rings, and the coils around the magnets act as an inductor so that there can be a swing backwards and forwards oscillation. So that's the electrical one, and there is what would otherwise be known as it's a standing wave oscillator, which is like nodes and antinodes of standing waves on top of each other. So that's a standing wave oscillator, which is similar, very similar in the way it works as to a Helmholtz resonator. It's very similar to how that works, and basically it's the Helmholtz resonator is like when you blow on a bottle and it makes that tone, whereas there's three variables that you tune, which is the length of the neck of the bottle, the volume of the bottle, and the diameter of the neck. Actually create a single frequency to come out at a certain wavelength. That's basically the one of the oscillators in the pyramid. So you've got three, and they're all lined. They're all in harmony with each other. They're all in harmony. They must be exactly synchronized. The other law to this is that the quartz crystal, if you put a line right down the center, shares both dimensions. It shares the third dimension and the subtle ethers, which let's just call the fourth dimension. It's in both. It actually is the communicator between both dimensions, and it works in both at the same time. The electrical circuit works in this dimension only, and it's a side effect from all the electromagnetism going on, but it is synchronized with the whole system at the same frequency. There's a base frequency which we'll get to, which these are all tuned to just one frequency, and there's then in the fourth dimension only operates the what's similar to a Helmholtz resonator, Helmholtz standing wave cavity It's a wave cavity, and basically that works in the fourth dimension. That's the pressure wave. So that's the pressure. The pressure wave, electrical wave. And the quartz, which is in both. And it doesn't oscillate like a normal crystal. It's not like electrically connected at all. There's no wires going to it. It gets its oscillations from this system, the pressure wave, the standing waves. The quartz is over the standing waves, and it oscillates, which we'll get to, vertically, on a vertical axis only. And the crystal is cut on its z-axis, and it oscillates. It's a quartz crystal, and it oscillates vertically. The pressure runs up and down the system only. So basically, that's very important to understand, because that explains how the whole system oscillates. Its base frequency. The input frequencies are where the tube comes in, but we've spoken about that. That's the information signal, which is overlaid over these stable continuous oscillations. It's the input, it's the information wave, the intelligent information, whereas this system, these three systems, just move at one frequency, and they're all tuned. It's easy to tune one of these systems. It's a very common electrical system. It's easy to understand the tuning of this system in the third dimension only, how its base frequency. This system is complex because I don't have all the variables to be able to tune it, because we're dealing with a wave which is not been played with like by my knowledge. It has, but there's such little information about it, and it changes its characteristics depending as well, which changes the tuning. So this system gets complicated. But basically these three, yeah, basically they're all the same frequency, and therefore they're all in rhythm and harmony with each other, and they allow it to work. This side representing the third dimension, this side representing the ethers, subtle ethers of the fourth dimension, and the quartz crystal, the little teardrop quartz crystal, marrying the two together, communicating ever between them. And also it's the transmitter which transmits out into the galaxies and the universe. So that's basically what we'll move on to. Is first I'll talk about the electrical oscillator, and because it's the simplest to understand, and also how it's sort of wired in the circuit, etc. Remember, as I spoke about earlier on, that same parts do at least two things. It's because they're doing things in different dimensions, but at the same time they must both be tuned with each other. So they're sort of hybrids. The parts are all hybrid between being compatible with two systems at once, and that's why the design's so clever, because they literally do two different things but are just one shape in two different dimensions, but are just one component, pretty much. So basically, to start with, the electrical circuit consists where it's actually what it is actually wired, what actually makes it up, sorry, are the two rings, the alpha omega rings, but I'm only going to draw the rings because they're the bulk of the capacitance. They're not wired together, because remember, the whole system is wired in series. It just is really simple. It's as simple as a battery with a load, a battery connected to a light bulb. Yeah, in a way it runs just like that. So you have these two rings, which become, because they're not touching, become the capacitor. Which is you need two parts to an oscillatory circuit. Also, bear in mind that the whole system is like a mirror in so many ways. It's like it's opposite. Each system is opposite from each other, but it's slightly different to give it its differential. It's a universal law. It runs through everything. We see it everywhere, but it's the same applies here. So basically, you have a capacitor. It's running to your. I don't know whether to give more information about this, but in regards to the polarities, but I'll do that later, I think. But basically, it's connected to the coils, which I'm not going to draw the magnets. It goes through the fire, which is zero resistance anyway, so it's just a straight line, electrically speaking. It goes to the other coil, or in electrically it's an inductor in the circuit. So you've got your inductors and you've got your capacitor, and then that's all you need to have an oscillatory circuit. It's tuned by the capacitor value set with these rings. You can't really adjust it because that's the thing, it occupies another function. It's not just a capacitor, we're just using it as one. But what you can do, you can tune these inductors. And that's by tuning the inductors and calculating what the capacitance is here, you can find out what frequency it is going to be. And you can test it with a frequency generator and an oscilloscope to actually find out its exact tuning, and that's really easy to do. It's very easy to do the electrical circuit oscillator here. Basically, this oscillator, I'll just explain now that the coils, I'll just double check this in the CAD drawing. The coils are in the system, which the circuit will come up on the screen, but the magnets here are, say if these coils are, well, in this direction as they are, they're in alignment with west and east. They're in alignment with the west pole running to the east pole. So if west is running this way, east through here goes to east, pretty much. So the south and north are here, for example. The alpha tip is orientated towards the south pole. The south pole comes in and goes, and it's pointing towards south. The coils and the running from west to east, and looking from west to east, they're wired counterclockwise, and that's because they run the same way as the magnetic fields do, which is north being here, oops, and south. So they run counterclock. You wire them counterclockwise, looking down them from west to east, and they're insulated. They're insulated, and the coil windings go from. Goodness me. There's a lot in the middle, and then they space out. And the reason they're wound like this is not for electrical purposes, but because they have to do two functions. You're winding them like that for the energy, but also their inductance value is what gives them an electrical their inductance value is what alters the tuning of this circuit electrically. But so you have to, the two systems are always combined, and you must accommodate both. The wire is insulated, just by varnish insulated. It's insulated for electrical purposes only, not energetically. Energetically, it's better if they're not insulated, but they have to be. It's better if they are, because they might contact the magnet or any part of the circuit, and short circuit. But basically, so you're looking down them, running from west to east. The orientation, they're wound counterclockwise, which is the same the field flows the same direction as a magnet flowing from south to north. And the wires go back through the file, and then it starts again, and it's exactly this coil here is exactly, has to be mirrored to this one. The same wiring through the same direction, the same the coil's wound the same way, the same pattern in the coil has to be. This is exactly mirrored. This is this exactly, has to be like that. Must. That's why it goes through this way, so it can start at this point again and be identical, basically. So yeah, that's the circuit. That's basically what the oscillatory circuit is. The actual frequency it's tuned to has to be the frequency of the other components, which we'll talk about. But basically, yeah, the way you tune this is the capacitance set, and at a certain value, and you'll have to play with these coils to tune them. And that's all basic, simple sort of physics. The diameter of the wire is like, I've just got some wire here, it's not the right size, but I've got heaps of different sizes. This one's a bit closer to it, but the diameter you'll have to play with as well. This is all stuff which is more, it's a science which you can only really make perfect once the system's working, because some of the variables at the moment I don't know. They're sort of unspecific variables. They're not the fundamental, because they're not really related directly to geometry. They're related more to how energy responds to materials, densities, masses, volumes, etc. But basically, everything has a dual zone. If the wire is too thin, the energy is going to sort of not be able to run through it properly. It's going to resist it, which it will anyway to a degree, but it's going to resist it through the wire where it shouldn't. So you have to, it has to be, the energy has to like, can't resist it too much. It can, but not too much. And that sort of governs really the diameter of the wire. Otherwise it could be any size. Electrically it wouldn't matter. But also, because of the current passing through it, you want it to be sort of thicker than thin. You want it more thick than thin. The windings here, which we came to the conclusion to, there's not actually that many, but it ranges from, I know the range is really broad, but what came up was between 3 and 10 windings, which is not many. That might be, I've got a feeling that's way incorrect. I'm not sure. But it could be. So it doesn't really matter, because the windings on this are only really to gain an electrical value of inductance. And there's heaps of variables. You could figure it all out, but you can't actually figure out this part of the circuit until you know the other part, which is the the range of what the other resonator is. Otherwise, yeah. So you can't tune this or do anything with it until the fundamental system's tuned, which is the Helmholtz Resonator comes first, the second the Quartz, the third the electrical circuit. The Helmholtz Resonator dictates the other two, pretty much, because it's where all that power comes from, and you can't change those values of that resonator as much. The Helmholtz, it's more set, because it's geometrically lined. It's all geometrically based. So basically, that's the electrical side of the circuit. Really briefly, it's just a simple oscillator of capacitor, inductance, but you must accommodate, you don't have to for the capacity, but you must accommodate for electrical inductance to tune this circuit, and also the fact that there's a different type of energy running through this system at the same time must accommodate both these coils. The next I'm going to talk about this little crystal here, the Quartz Oscillator. The Quartz Oscillator in the system is not connected like an electrical oscillator. It doesn't just create an oscillation electrically. It doesn't have really anything to do with, like, there's no wires connected to it. It's not connected to the electrical circuit. It doesn't work like that. The oscillator in the pyramid is really huge, and electrically it would never really work because it's so big. This is just a little crystal. It's not the right one. But the quartz oscillator is in the shape of, like, it's sort of in the shape of a tear, and the reason for that is because it can have, it can be quite variable. It can have between 4 and 6 sides. So probably the best way to make it would just be to get a quartz on its z-axis, a synthetic quartz, high grade, nice, really high grade, synthetic quartz is high grade, to cut down its z-axis, and basically in this shape. So you can have the 6 sides on it, that's fine. You can have 6 sides, 4 and 6 sides, or you could do, I did a pyramid, but I don't think it works near as well. And besides, my pyramid, crystal cut pyramid, is not right because the base is flat. It needs to be round because the lower reflector, so if this is the central point of the system, of the quartz crystal, the lower disc is the same concave, so that the energy just passes through the bottom of it. It's different how it goes through the top, but the way it oscillates is between these two. It's just the energy goes through it between these here and here. So this has to be circular from its central point, the focal point of this concave silver reflector down the bottom. So there's no like lensing or anything like that. It just goes, literally all these lines sort of straight. They just go through that, and that's straight. The crystal disc is the same. Oops. It all goes through as if it's straight but curved on the curvature required. So it's really simple to understand optics. And all that energy, all the energy from this is focused on a point as small as you can get it. It's one single focal point. To put extreme amounts of pressure on that little crystal and get it to really work when it's all working. But basically, so this quartz is the oscillator. It does, speaking in this system, I'll just draw it again, what it's doing is oscillating, creating it's a base frequency. The waves, the pressure waves, I'll draw them like the pressure waves going through it are at a certain frequency, which is the other resonator. If the 3 resonators or oscillators we're talking about, the quartz having the same frequency as the electrical and the standing wave resonator. So these are the standing waves here coming from the pressure oscillator, and this quartz is tuned to that same frequency. And the way you tune a quartz crystal, depending on which axis it's running on, which is its z-axis, it's only in one way. It's running in one direction. It's not multiple axes. It's simple. It's just up and down, running through the center on its z-axis, this axis. So basically, the way you tune it is its size. Because it's a certain shape, the only way you can tune it is adjusting the shape to accommodate, and this is where you need the services of somebody that really knows what they're doing, and they can test it. Because the way this crystal is stimulated is by pressure waves, a wave which we don't use because it's an etheric pressure wave. It's not the way a quartz oscillates in common physics. It's different. It's with a longitudinal standing etheric pressure wave, which we don't even know that much about. But basically, it's a pressure wave. It's a longitude. It's like a sound wave, but it's really completely superior, and it can pass through solid things as well. Basically, yeah, it's like, think of it as an electromagnetic wave that is longitudinal. It'll pass through, but it has pressure nodes and energy nodes. Yeah, so this crystal is tuned by altering its size and its its volume and its shape slightly. So because it must accommodate two functions again, it's an oscillator for pressure, but it also must have geometry because of the way the energy is affected. And that's basically the ultimate shape is a teardrop, pretty much, because it's got an apex which is aligned with the pyramid apex, the energy coming down. Just draw it again, which is white sharp at the top, and it's really active here as well. But it's round at the bottom so that it doesn't refract when the energy goes through it. Just goes straight through. It'll refract up here, but it's different. It works different up the top. It's not nearly as important. The bottom is where it must be all correct. So yeah, the crystal. I mean, just to get in. Also, I'll get into the function of the crystal as well to sort of cover two areas. So we've spoken about how the crystal is an oscillator and how it must be tuned, and how it's tuned. And really, I mean, it's sort of, you can predict to a degree its frequency by doing calculating the volume of it and how fast you can mechanically figure out how it's going to oscillate by figuring out how fast a vibration travels through quartz, and figuring out what its base frequency is. But it doesn't always work out quite that simply. So basically, because it's being pressurized, the quartz is a dual oscillator as well. It's being pressurized by the longitudinal wave, but mechanically, because this is nodes and antinodes, mechanically in this dimension, it must mechanically match up. So the internal oscillations in this ringing of the crystal has to match with the pressure waves inside the pyramid, governed by the resonator, the Helmholtz standing wave cavity, which we'll get into. So these are the two systems that must match up. You've got your energy system here, is the etheric energy and powers, and the mechanical oscillation here, which it must be synchronized. Everything must be synchronized. And yeah, we'll get into the other system which you can adjust to tune everything as well, because we've so far spoken about the electrical oscillator, the quartz oscillator, and next will become the standing wave pressure cavity oscillator, Helmholtz, similar to Helmholtz Resonator in physics. So now what the quartz does, we'll get into that, because while we're talking about quartz and the crystal, in regards to the quartz as what it does in the pyramid. Okay, I spoke earlier on that the pyramid has two hotspots, major hotspots, as in where all the activity and action is going on at the greatest magnitude. And the first one, I said everything was set up for the tube, the file. I said basically that all processes push the energy coming in, the alpha omega vortexing in and feeding it, and the magnetic void here is all focused really on getting this transducer oscillating and getting all the power happening in and out of the dimensions here. This central point, you got 1, 2, 3 systems focused on the fourth, which is the tube, equivalent to the King's Chamber in the Giza design, basically. So that's the first, hotspot. But what it's actually all set up for, see, this is energy, and then it's overlaid with an amplified information wave. So you've got your information, your energy. As I spoke about in the beginning, there's 2 main systems in the whole pyramid. And just to bear in mind, you actually could take out the Quartz Oscillator and everything to begin with. You don't have to tune it or even have it in the system at all. You can take out this component and a few other components just to accumulate energy, and you'll get a result just by accumulating the energy in the middle. The first thing you need to focus on is the accumulation of getting the energy built up in the pyramid. This fiddly business of tuning the crystal and having a crystal, you need it to transmit a signal out of the pyramid, but in the way it's designed. But to get a result, you can take it out of the system, because you won't be able to tune this system unless this one works, or any of the oscillators for that matter. This is sort of simple. It just accumulates energy, whereas this is all frequency and tuning and everything, pretty much. So the 2 hotspots being here and here, the quartz, the center of the quartz, you see all of this, the concave reflector at the bottom of the pyramid, the big one. Basically its job is to keep, as a dual function, it keeps the energy in the pyramid, but the concave value of this reflector reflects back to the center of the crystal, reflects through this crystal. And what's it doing in that whole process? All the energy here surrounding the tube and in this area is all being pushed upwards and focused into the crystal. So every process that happens in the pyramid moves to one little point that's smaller than the size of a pinhead. It goes all the way down to that. That's what everything is. It all gets collapsed down into the little crystal. And so, speaking as an AM radio, this is your carrier wave, which is overlaid, it's just a set wave frequency, which is overlaid with the information wave, which comes from this area. This is the energy system, the powerhouse, so to speak, and the information is all this area. This is the transmitter, where it's all, this is, because unlike a radio, this is all geometric and 3-dimensional. It's not just oscillations, it's 3-dimensional oscillations, all focused using the law of optics through this crystal, where it transmits out huge longitudinal waves are transmitting out into the universe using this holographic frequency of this pyramid to be intercepted by other pyramids the same as this, but by everything else at the same time. Depending on what you're focusing on, the focus is the hologram, and the hologram is transmitted out. And that's how it works. Thoughts are holograms. They're shapes. And the shapes oscillate with each other because they match, like a basic oscillation where the oscillations are just the same and they match, like a radio. This etheric transmission are holograms. holographic shapes which must be overlaid. And that's why there's infinite number of bands, because unlike an oscillating wave, it's 3D. It goes on. You can transmit into the past, you can transmit into the future, you can transmit, it transmits over long distances, because as soon as you get into the holographic waves, your thought becomes anything possible, because it's the fundamental principle. You're transmitting from here on a universal language system. It's an emotional language that's universal. It's interchangeable between all living things, everything, animals, plants, metals, humans, planets, galaxies, all speak using the same universal language, three-dimensional holographic waves. Our radio waves are just three-dimensional. They're just a side effect of electromagnetism, which is a side effect of things happening in the ethers, but they're such a low frequency, and they're just linear. They're just a single oscillation. This is where it all happens here. So that's quite simply how the crystal works. There's also a reflector up here, which I'll get into it. The mercury, it's much smaller than that, but the double concave mercury reflector, which it doesn't really act as like an optimum reflector. It more blocks the energy. It doesn't have to be accurate when it's being sent back as much. Oops. But it does to a degree, but it sort of stopped. It's only putting back pressure on this equilibrium point, this focal point here. It's sort of the pressure. You only need one side of the oscillator here. Between here, there's the focal point of the crystal. So if it's like a mirror, there's like two worlds, the world above and the world below. And in the world above, in this case, just keeps the energy trapped up here in the capstone and the mercury reflector. It's not really an oscillator, but the world below it's a backwards and forwards communication between the lower reflector and the crystal. This is the focal point, the center of that crystal. So, and basically, that's how the crystal oscillates. I'll get into the waves that oscillate it next, which are the standing waves. But the function and the tuning, I've spoken about how the crystal's tuned and how it oscillates, how it mechanically and etherically oscillates. Now, I'm explaining what it's doing, and that is taking all these processes from the reactor, the vortex drive, the everything, which all are actually focused in this hot spot here, the tube, and they're all being sent up through this concave reflector. It's not a parabol or an elliptical reflector, it's concave. It's really simple. And all focused, accurately focused, and the reflector I had that was made, I got down to about 0.5 mil in diameter, which is pretty wide, but it's supposed to be like really just the size of a pinhead. But basically, that was my focal point diameter, but it's supposed to be as small as possible. If it's made accurately, it will be very small. And focused on this, because this crystal is the transmitter for the whole system. It sort of does multiple things. It keeps the system oscillating to a degree. It acts on a small level as a capacitor of energy, but really it's taking all this information here, which is all this information, I'll just go over it again, is energy, pressure oscillations, and information, which is picked up by your your aura, so if that's a person, an anorexic person with an aura around them, which I'll just quickly explain. The aura contains all the information. It contains the subtle vibrations through it. The aura is actually vibrating in the ethers. It's not electromagnetic as people think it is. There's a bit of electromagnetism that comes off the body, but it's not really related. The aura is the subtle vibrations and colors, which, because the vibrations come from different colors and holograms and stuff like that. The pyramids, through the pyramid is sucking the aura into it, as we spoke. This is just in more detail. It's sucking the aura into it, into the middle, which is actually here. So your information's going in here. It's being it's interacting and feeding back using this whole system, which we explained. So it's amplifying. So this amplified aura, which is information, energy and standing waves, is all focused onto this. The sum of all processes go to this one single little point. And this is sort of where it's getting into the 0 point, really. And that point is, and this crystal's vibrating like crazy, and it's light's coming out of it, and it's hot and this and that, and it's going crazy, and it's transmitting all of your information, the energy that's been created by these systems, out to the universe, to yourself, to everything. It's intention and thought and everything. Incredibly dangerous to use it. I mean, when I get the pyramid working, I'm not going to be using it, that's for sure. Not until I know exactly. It has to be done with great caution, because this is very dangerous to send out thoughts this strong. If you don't know what you're doing, you could actually destroy yourself. You could send yourself completely insane, or you could do things which were just incredibly positive. As I said, it's just going to amplify whatever thoughts you already have and actualize them, depending on different thresholds as to how effective the transmission is. But a weak pyramid to start with, I think, is the idea, to have a weakest possible transmissions, but have the system up and running and stable at the same time. So that's basically what the quartz does. It's how it oscillates, and it's how it transmits the energy. And yeah, it is the sum of all processes, all focused, everything that happens is concentrated down to the size of a pinhead, smaller than the size of a pinhead. Yeah, so you've got your sphere of layers. That was all the concentric spheres in the beginning, all down to the inside of the quartz, the nothingness, and then transmitted everywhere in a three-dimensional etheric hologram. The next system I'm going to talk about is the third of the three oscillators, being the pressure, or the longitudinal, or the Helmholtz wave cavity oscillator. Yeah, it doesn't really have a name because it does all those things, and it is all those things. And that system, just turn this over. That system is set up using three things basically. So remember, it's all tuned to the quartz crystal tier and the electrical oscillator, capacitor, inductor, the quartz in both dimensions, and now we're talking about the third oscillator, the pressure wave. And basically that oscillator, the components it uses is, it's not a very good disc, is the lower disc, the big silver thick crystal, silver disc. It's concave to the quartz. and we'll get into, I might explain it now, I should probably, because it's part of the whole similar system. It consists of this reflector, the other reflector here, which keeps the energy trapped, mercury disk, which I'll explain later. Basically, it's like the tube, but it's contained with mercury and salt, but it doesn't work the same. And there's a hole in the disc. It's just one hole, it's little, it's very small. And what this resonator does is it takes the energy from the hot spot of the tube and all the energy around this area. After it's been turned into an oscillation, or while it's being turned into an oscillation, this energy is the pressure. It's just pressure, let's say. And if you draw the other reflectors, I'm going to draw it very well. They're a bit bigger than that, but see, I'm drawing the invisible sphere thing, and it's not right. And the two spheres of pressure, there's two. Is that making this too complicated? It's going all over the place. But basically the sphere of pressure here, because it's trapped pressure, is potential. And what happens is, in that sphere of energy, there's a little one here as well. This is another, the spheres within spheres. The pressure here in these spheres gets turned into a pressure oscillation of standing waves. And the way it does that is through the oscillations of this crystal, which is influenced to do it as well by the it's all synchronized, the electrical circuit, and the way this is tuned. This cavity, this big reflector really acts, and this reflector is keeping the pressure in, act as a wave cavity oscillator. So what's happening is these waves are going up and down here. They're crashing into each other, but tuned correctly, they're crashing into each other in a way where they don't cancel each other out. And remember, this is all in the ether that's going on. I might just try it again. It's getting... that's alright. They're crashing into each other in a way where they just increase in amplitude, and these points are where the pressure is great, and these points is where there's no pressure. So there's heaps of pressure here, and no pressure where the lines are. So you've got this, and that's standing wave theory, that's physics, and it's universal as well. Just depends on what wave you're dealing with, but they can stand or cancel each other. And basically, this wave, this cavity sets up the standing waves because it's bouncing backwards and forwards at a certain frequency, which matches the quartz and the oscillatory circuit. And the way, basically these pressure waves are like, yeah, you need a wave to transmit, and that's why they're created. But to tune these waves so that they oscillate at a certain frequency, the way to do it is complex in the pyramid, because this system has to match up with all the other systems. This cavity, wave cavity, has to synchronize. The waves have to be standing in a fashion, and I figured out what it is, the nodes and antinodes. It's like there's a certain that's right, yeah, there's about 20 nodes between this disc and this disc. There's about 20 nodes as far as I understand, which have to all match so that the quartz is on the node, or that is on a pressure zone, whereas here there's no pressure really. Just how it works. And it all has to match so that it bounces off the discs and it's all lined up perfectly. And it's a bit fiddly, actually. It is a bit fiddly and messy. You have to find a mode which works pretty much so that you've got action. So it lines up here, here, and the pressure point lines up here as well. And with the symbol, it's actually quite complicated, and this is the system I least understand, because I don't have any of the variables to understand how to tune it either, because it's tuned, because I don't have anything to calculate the tuning with, because the ether wave is not, the variables of it in the pyramid aren't known. Its speed, its control, and I think the variables change. I think it'll have to be figured out in a different kind of a way, because there's heaps of ways to figure it out, but you won't be able to figure it out until the vortex in the energy in the pyramid is working, because there's nothing to figure it out with. You can only figure it out if you've got ether in the pyramid, because without the ether in the pyramid you can't create any of these waves. They're longitudinal ether waves. This system is all happening in the fourth dimension. The standing wave cavity all happens in the fourth dimension, and yeah, it's actually part of the tune. Yeah, it's basically a bit of an empty. It's an unrefined aspect of the pyramid. It's the most unrefined aspect, and it's the last aspect which you'll have to concern yourself with after you get the energy. You need it to run the pyramid, but you need to focus on getting the energy of the pyramid first. But basically what has to happen, so yeah, you've got your, I'll just draw on the graph. Basically what has to happen is it has to be tuned, and the main governing factors of how to tune the cavity is the lower disc, the hole here is how you tune it. You've got your quartz up here, energy, etc. That looks better. You have to tune it, and the way you have to see, the first variable which you don't have any control over to tune it is how much pressure you've got in that cavity. Ether pressure. And you can't, there's no way of knowing that until you've got the whole thing set up, actually. It's sort of like almost, you're going to have to artificially stimulate the cavity using different waves and try and get them synchronized and find the hot and cold spots, because I don't know, there's nothing to go by really, but I do know the principles of how to tune it, and that is, it depends, the first variable to how to tune it, which is one, is ether pressure, how much pressure is in this cavity, which is going to dictate, it's part of it's how it oscillates, at what rate. But the way you actually can tune this system is two ways, and that's all to do with, there's a hole in the lower disc, and there has to be a hole, and I'll just briefly explain what the hole does. This is all I'm going to talk about, the hole, because it's important. Without this little hole, nothing works in the whole system, actually. That's how important it is. So it must be there, and the reason for the hole, again, there are two reasons. Oops, two reasons. But number one, the second reason is to do with the tuning, but first of all, what the hole's primary function is, and it's only a little hole, the base that I have, which is 330 millimeters diameter, the whole range is about, because it must fulfill two requirements, so you must accommodate both. The hole range is about 0.45 millimeters in diameter to 0.85 millimeters in diameter. And I went to a lot of effort figuring that out, but I also had a lot of insights into it with Daniela's pyramid because it works the same way. So the hole's really small, and what it does is, so you keep that in mind, at a 330 millimeter diameter base, where the disc will be 165 mil diameter, I think, the whole diameter is the range, the optimum working range is about between 0.45 millimeters diameter to 0.85 millimeters in diameter. That's the size of the hole. And yeah, the reason for that is because, the two reasons for the hole. Number one, its main reason is that it lets a bit of energy out of the whole system, and why it has to do that is because the energy is coming into the pyramid. It's, as we spoke about all this earlier on, it's feeding back, it's going around the system, going up the alpha, jumping across the ring, and then it goes to the vortex. So basically you've got heaps of energy in the system. And what happens is, if that energy kept building up, it would hit a certain point and it would freeze, because and it would stop coming in. It would be blocked from coming in because there's no release. You see, what you've done is you've filled up the vacuum with energy, and it's so efficiently made, these discs and everything. It's radiating out like some energy, but it's the inflow is going to be slowed way down, and it's just going to be a positive pressure potential in the middle. It's just going to be a pressure zone which is frozen, because it can't really build up, and because it's frozen, it's going to slow down the spin and everything. It's going to like choke the whole system. So what happens is, instead of having just this huge ball of potential in the middle which is sort of frozen and can't do anything, it's like filling up a bottle until it's full, and then it can't be filled anymore, and you can't continue to fill it either because you can't get the pressure in there because it's filled. The pressure's already really high in the bottle. So that's what it's like. What the hole does is, it's an enlarged version of the hole, is it lets, and because the hole's put over the major energy, where the energy is pushing strongest against the disc, which is the center of the disc. That's why the hole's in the very center, and you want it in the center as well, because it's the equilibrium point, so it can oscillate properly. So it's in the exact center of the disc, and so some energy must be released, so that you've got the energy coming in here, it's feeding back, you've got potential, but at the same time it's being released, so it can continue to come in. So basically the whole system then becomes this giant capacitor which is leaking off a bit of energy, but at the same time you're feeding it with more energy, so it can actually work. The whole system has to flow. It can't freeze up. It has to be in motion, and that motion is created by that rule. The energy comes in, it feeds back, and at the same time it's going out. And it's going out here as well, but it's going out in a different way. The actual etheric pressure, these are standing waves, but the actual pressure that's in the system must be released out of the system. So this is outside of the system, it's going in, it's feeding back. You've got the pressure built right up here to its threshold, needs to be, and then a bit's released out of the hole, basically. That's just the way it has to be. It has to be in motion here and here. Everything has to be moving at all times. There can't be anything froze up or stiffened or yeah, so basically this allows for constant motion. Think of like, I can't think of like an analogy at the moment, but think of like a black hole. If when they suck in energy, like if they're eating up a star or something like that, and they're sucking the energy into the center, you know, some energy is shot out of the center of the black hole. It just can't eat it all, and it's shooting it out into space like that on its perpendicular to its vortex. It's the same sort of thing, really. The black hole is a giant out of control pyramid, self-perpetuating, just gone crazy, pretty much. And it's, yeah, think of the jets coming out of a black hole as this hole here, the release of energy, which is built right up. I don't know, if it was blocked, it would just probably build up and stay there, and it would slow down and the system might collapse, basically, and just go from a collapsed state to starting state constantly, or it could melt down. I'm not sure, but basically it needs to be a hole. You don't want it blocked. It probably wouldn't, it needs it to start, like you just need that hole. For this simple explanation, energy coming in, feeding back. Once you've got the pressure, you need to release some. That's basically how it is. There has to be motion at all times. So yeah, that's the hole. That's the first thing it does, pressure release. But as a dual function, as every component of the pyramid does, at least one function, basically the second function, which is what we're talking about, is you use it to tune the oscillator. The etheric pressure wave cavity being the oscillator. And it's similar, the only analogy I can give you is that it's similar to a Helmholtz Resonator, where you have basically a Helmholtz Resonator in physics is a cavity or a bottle with a neck. The volume of the cavity, which represents the etheric pressure, the diameter of the opening, meaning the diameter of the hole, and plus the length of the hole, so diameter and the length of this hole change the base frequency inside the resonator. So these three need to be lined up to create, these three variables will create a frequency, and they have to be in working range as well. And the frequency that they create lines up with the other two oscillatory circuits, being the quartz and the electrical oscillator. As we spoke about earlier on, the three oscillators must match up. So the standing longitudinal waves in this cavity, which are tuned by, you can't really alter the diameter of the disc. You can't, it's geometrically set based on octave collapse theory. But the way you can tune the hole is by its diameter and its depth. So the disc can be customized slightly, made thinner at the middle, and not choked up. So you can't let too much energy escape, the 0.45 to 0.85. If you've got a weak pyramid, you need a smaller hole. But if it's a large pyramid, the hole can be bigger because it has to release more energy. There's like a threshold, you have to find that middle point. Again, everything has a hotspot sort of point where it works. And again, there's no way to govern this, but basically you'd start off with a small hole, and you'd have to somehow increase the diameter, or have interchangeable holes within a silver reflective system, to find the most efficient spot and that can't be calculated because it depends on how efficient your pyramid's going to be. How much pressure it's going to build up in the middle depends on what size you need the hole. Pressure, speaking energetically, but to tune the oscillator, you need to play with it more and adjust. I mean, basically, what would be left to play with would be the height of the hole to get the frequency tuned, so to speak, so that it's in tune with the other two oscillators, the quartz and the electrical. So it's a little bit complicated, but everything must match with everything else, and I'm explaining how it must match with everything else and the variables you have to work with. So just keep it as simple as possible. Bear in mind the hole is a pressure release, number one, for the system, which I explained here. Number two, it adjusts the tuning of the longitudinal wave oscillator, the cavity wave oscillator, where all the energy in the middle is turned into standing waves and passed through the quartz and reflected back to create the standing waves. And yeah, basically that is sort of the gist of that cavity, how it's tuned, how the hole affects the tuning, what the hole does, which I explained as well, and how the cavity, to look at it as an analogy, it's not quite the same, but it works similar to a Helmholtz Resonator, where you blow on a bottle and it makes that tone. It's similar in the way you tune it, but it's not similar in the way the waves pass through it. So yeah, you've got your standing waves running from the center, the focal point of the crystal, to the bottom of the reflector. And yeah, standing waves are nodes and antinodes of pressure. You see, because once you've got the potential in the middle, to turn it into a wave and oscillate it is what must come next. And that's how you get transmission potential. Otherwise, it's just energy. You're turning the energy in the middle into something, you're refining it pretty much just as potential and turning it into a wave. It's like electricity, the way we understand things. You have electricity, you can do anything with it. It represents the energy in the pyramid and the ethers. You can turn electricity into an oscillation or audio or whatever you want, and that's what's going on in these processes. The pyramids turn it into a uniform standing wave that also contains the information coming from your aura through the tube. It's being put into the system, overlaid. So you've got your standing wave, and it's overlaid, well, it's at a set oscillation like that, but it's overlaid with information which is just going to move at that same oscillation like an AM radio, but it has information overlaid. And the information can be any frequency whatsoever. It can be whatever the aura is, base frequency of the etheric aura is what this is going to be. The actual frequency of the system, the way we understand frequencies, mechanical and electrical frequencies, is basically, look, the diameter of this quartz crystal is on that CAD drawing. That's the closest we could figure out what the diameter was. So again, look at the CAD drawing. It's all to scale. Everything and every curvature and volume and shape is to scale, as much as I know about the design. And the diameter of the quartz, I think, according to this, let me just see. That's smaller system. But if that's that, the quartz basically is between, the diameter of the quartz is a rough reference, is between 9 and 12 millimeters. At a 260 millimeters to 330 millimeter base diameter, that range. The quartz, the diameter of it is about 9 to 12 mil. Must be round at the bottom. And the frequency of the whole system, what seems to come up continually, is that it's quite a low frequency Like it has the information wave can be any frequency whatsoever, but the carrier wave that the whole system is stable under is quite low. I think it's about 700, and it's around 750 kilohertz. So let's draw this again. You've got your Quartz Oscillator, you've got your Electrical Oscillator, and you've got your pressure wave oscillator in the cavity. These three oscillators, have one frequency, and I think it's in the kilohertz range. I'm pretty sure it's above audio. It's in the kilohertz range. It's low frequency. It's in the AM band range. Doesn't have to be high frequency. What this frequency does, and keep this in mind, whereas in AM radio the carrier frequency is higher than the audio frequency, but this basic frequency here is just so the whole system is running off a stable frequency, and everything is communicating to itself in the two dimensions. Oops. The third dimension and the fourth dimension. Stabilizes everything. It's all in communication with itself, and basically it stabilizes everything. It's all in communication with itself, and basically this frequency is quite low in the kilohertz range, and the course is quite big. You can roughly figure it out. I figured out it is in the kilohertz range at that diameter, roughly, and that's sort of to go by. To try and figure out the frequency, probably focus. I mean, this system is dependent on this system is dependent on this system, but probably the focus to figure out the base frequency, what it is by going by the volume and the diameter of this quartz crystal, basically. So it's going to give you the closest representation of what that base frequency is. And so, yeah, kilohertz. Let's just say kilohertz. The tube runs most efficiently in that range as well, the kilohertz range. So you've got your carrier wave, which is this low frequency kilohertz wave, and you've got your emotional information, which is overlaid over it, pretty much. And the reason the carrier wave is so low in frequency, it's a good thing, because it's not disturbing. Because it's so low frequency, it's not going to disturb frequencies higher and lower than it. And emotional wavelengths can be any frequency. They operate dual. They operate on every level. Emotional wavelengths operate on a really low frequency, which is audible sound frequency. Or they can be really high. They can be as high as light, invisible. Just so high, the wavelength can be so small, like just this tiny, teeny, wavelength, which is going on really close together waves. But they're overlaid over this wave, because this wave must be there to stabilize the whole system. And it literally, keep referring back to amplitude modulation, how waves are the first radios to be created, the concept amplitude modulation. It works the same way. It's the same as an AM radio. You've got your base wave, which is a set frequency in the kilohertz range. 3 oscillators tuned to one frequency. Information, which is the tube is responsible, and all of the other processes overlaid over these standing waves inside the cavity of the pyramid, transmitted onto that crystal, sent out across the galaxy, is the information. So you got your carrier to get the whole system working and your information. That's probably the best I can explain that. The oscillators, I know they're a bit technical, but they're simple at the same time if you look at them individually. This oscillator is the most unclear of how to tune, because we don't have the variables, and you can't find the variables until the energy system of the pyramid is working. This is what you leave till last. But basically, these two are easy to understand, and that's basically it. That's how the system stabilizes and transmits its energy. It's energy coming from your aura, which is the input to the system. The rest of the components and what I've covered is basically the really sort of heavy, complex side of the pyramid. The components I'll be talking about now are supporting components, which basically support all of the processes that I've mentioned. They aid the pyramid to get it to start up, and sort of like tweaking components. They're like subtle. They're like the subsystems, the subsystems of the pyramid, which are required for it to work properly. And the first component, which I'm going to mention, is required for it to work at all, and that is just turn this over, is what I call the Romanian Box. Ooh. And it's a funny little component. I've always been fond and fascinated with it. And what's interesting is, it's the component that I focused on the least, but in fact, it's the most important in regards to getting the system to work. And for some reason, whenever I went to sensitives, this component always came up first, always. And it seems so insignificant in a way, but it's just a little box in the corner of the pyramid, but it actually, you need it because it's actually what starts the pyramid. Without it, the pyramid won't start up. It needs it to start it up, to encourage it to start flowing the energy. So basically, it does two things, as per usual. The first thing it does is it starts the system. Basically, I'm going to the subsystems, but its function is to start the system. But what it actually does is two things. And this is where it gets into the crystal radio briefly. But basically, the first thing it does is it transduces light to electricity. The second thing it does is it transduces energy to copper wires. It transduces, basically collects energy and sends them down the wires. Sort of like it's like a pathway in regards to energy. The energy is coming in and it puts it in a certain direction. It's basically, it's equivalent to it's a hybrid between, it's basically a solar cell and or a diode. It's like the famous 1N3 for a Romanian diode, which is the magical little part which makes crystal radios work. As a very sensitive diode that can run on just a very small amount of current, and it will act as a diode. So it's like a diode. So it allows the energy to go in one direction only. But what it also is a cell, a solar cell. It's a solar cell for light and also energy as well. That's why it's made of germanium and not silicon, because, and I'll get to that, it's to do with the spectrums, but basically it's a solar cell, like as in a solar panel. Solar panels stacked up on top of each other in series. So basically the incoming light and energy through the photoelectric effect is converted into voltage. That's for the light. The energy coming in and hitting the panels gets turned into gets put into a direction. So you've got these two lines represent electricity, but because it's organic and it's a system inside an energy system, you have energy going down the thing, going down the copper wires in the circuit, pretty much. I drew it in the circuit. I mean, you know, it's in series with the circuit, basically. But yeah, there's a lot to talk about it actually. It's simple and sort of easy to understand, but there's still a bit to talk about. I mean, in the circuit, it's in series, you see, with the whole thing. It's at the end of the circuit, really. So you've got your coil here, just briefly. You've got your omega ring. Which one, that right? You've got your alpha that goes through. Here you've got your coils, your tube, and you've got your box highlighted up here. The germanium. Germanium's a funny element. It's so weird and mysterious. And it sort of looks like that's a piece of silicon. It looks similar to that. It's a dark sort of metal. Here's a package of 1N34A diodes, which I got to try and make one of these out of diodes. It didn't work. It's not going to work. There's reasons for that, but they're little diodes which the crystal radio uses. They're basically miniature versions of this box. The box is equivalent, really. It's the same. It's a more efficient version of these diodes in series. That's what it is. So think of the diode as exactly the same, but more inefficient version of this component in the pyramid. Romanian Box, wired in series. And there's a little solar cell here as well. Stole of the calculator is going to buy heaps from overseas, but I was thinking by that point that I was sort of sick of doing this stuff because I was running out of money, and this is one I made ages ago. This is not right at all, but back in the early days, I thought that it was a capacitor in the system, because I had to start off with nothing and create the design out of thin air. So back in the early days, I knew there was a box that kept coming up, and I thought it was a capacitor of some sort. So this is like mica. This is natural mica, just in between copper plates. So it's pretty much a capacitor, but with mica. I thought it was like a capacitor that had energy. I was on the right track, but it wasn't quite right. So it just is a relic now. But basically what's happening is, the way the box works is, so you've got two vectors, two inputs. Remember, you've got your, let's draw that again. I'll draw it like this. The germanium's funny. It's like it has in the pyramid, it actually has a different color from the rest of the circuit. This box, when it's working, has a little aura around it, and it's sort of green, smoky greeny color. So it's like an entity unto itself. I see the parts as sort of living with personalities and emotions, and because I think in actuality that's what everything is. But the pyramid makes them alive, makes them stronger, their personalities and whatnot. But basically, the ring, the coil, and the alpha going through, as you know, not touching that ring. It's too close. I've drawn it too close. And the load, what am I drawing here? The coils, the tube, the coil, and then to the box. So the box, as I said, is a diode, and it's moving in this direction. It's positive is here. Anode cathode, which is probably a more accurate way to explain it rather than positive and negative, because it has a slightly different meaning. It's more like anode cathode is more feminine and masculine derivative, but basically, so what it is think of it as a germanium diode or a solar cell. It's the same thing. It's a diode, but it has a surface so that it can collect two types of energy, and that is because it's in line with the pyramid vector, the energy vector on the pyramid on that picture. And so it's in line with the vector of energy coming in to the pyramid, the back of the pyramid. So it's in line with the vector that goes up to that eventually goes through the file. There's two vectors that go through the file, and this is one of them. So it's at the back of the pyramid. Let me just see if I've drawn this. The top view correct. Yeah, it is correct on the schematic, which will come up. But it's slightly out of date, this schematic. But basically, it's in the right spot. It's at the northeast corner of the pyramid. And it's on, if the pyramid's split into 12 levels, it's on roughly about level 2. So if level 0 being the bottom, level 12 being the apex of the pyramid, it's on, if you subdivide that into 12 divisions, it's roughly around level 2. It doesn't really matter too much. It just has to be on that energy vector. So this is the energy vector going in. The energy coming in here is sent down these wires. It runs across this. But this is where the other important part is, and you have the panels on their sides, and you have to give it an energy source, a light source. Basically, you have to give it a light source coming in here, and you have to have like mirrors on the back or something. I've tried this, and it works if you set it up right. I've simulated it, and the light has to touch. It has to be cast on the front of the panels, pretty much. So your light has to come in so they can work as a photocell and go through the system, literally, as this represents. This box is many of these, in like many diodes in series. And the reason, well, just before I forget, so you basically got your energy, and you've got your light. And they both work together, because what happens is the energy comes in here, but it can't go any further. It's not encouraged, there's not enough energy coming in for it to jump across the gap. This is what the gap's all about. But the light, because this box works as a dual function for energy and light, electricity, these photocells generate a voltage. Now there must be heaps in series with a certain surface diameter to be efficient enough, it must generate at least 260 volts. Because the voltage that it must produce must be enough to jump between this gap and this gap, this initial gap with an argon remainder in the pyramid, an argon inert gas. The energy it first of all has to electrically arc between these 2 points, and so the energy that's running on this, the energy coming into the box, that is also, because the plates are picking up 2 types of energy, the light which is being artificially shone at the plates that are positioned on their side so the light can actually touch the plates, like a high powered beam coming in here pretty much of light which is the germanium picks up. And so you've got a high voltage here, which you achieve that by having them all in series, and it has to jump across this gap. So, and then it, with the energy in this line here, between here and here, it can start moving around the system as well. So you're using an electrical, you're using voltage in this dimension, 3D, to allow the energy in the 4th dimension, or just the subtle dimension, subtle ethers, to jump and pass through the circuit as well. So they're both like sort of together, moving together, energy and electricity, both. And the energy comes from that vector because it's in line with it. The light comes from just a source you shine at the box, and together you can get the system flowing pretty much. And the reason we use germanium is because it's more efficient than a silicon. It's more efficient in converting the light into electricity, and it's more efficient in converting energy. It's more efficient at collecting energy and putting it down down the wires. It's sort of superior to silicon in that way, but it's not as silicon you can run at a higher voltages and so forth. I mean, they have strengths and weaknesses, but germanium's very subtle and sensitive, and that's why it's the element of choice. NASA use germanium solar cells on their satellites because they're more efficient than silicon, because space and mass and weight is an issue up there. To get it into space, they want the best. So there's a company that makes these cells for NASA. I've forgotten what it is. It's written on my computer somewhere, but you need to have, because they're not available commonly on the market, germanium solar cells as far as I'm aware, so you need to have them specially made, and they need to be exposed to the vacuum. They can't have a plate over them. It's better if they're crystal germanium rather than like less efficient solar cells like the calculator one. It's just all ground up and made and sort of painted on, but you need to actually have and the reason for that is because the light only needs the actual element germanium to act as a semiconductor to get the diode effect, to photoelectric effect, to create the voltage. But the thickness, you need a bit of thickness because that's how the energy is absorbed into the cell, because it's doing a dual function. Remember, it's not just converting it into voltage, otherwise I could have a battery here, and you can't do that. You can't just put a battery or a high voltage power supply, DC, because it's DC, remember, has to be, because it has to move in one direction to give it a polarity. The whole system has to move in this direction. But it can't just be a simple solar cell. It has to have mass. The germanium cells that are in series, let's say if they're flat plates like this, and so you wire them all in, because they have to be in series to get the voltage up. It doesn't matter about the current. So all these cells are wired in series, and these germanium cells and you need at least 260 volts to be able to for the spark to jump between here and here, which is to start the energy flowing across the system, pretty much. And basically, you need that many cells to achieve that voltage. You probably need you have to have it made properly, and it has to be made small. It can't be too big. The box can't be too big in the pyramid, because it's going to start affecting other things. So it's not going to be a cheap thing to make at all. But it must be made, and you can't just use normal solar cells. It must be made out of germanium chips. These little chips, they can't just be flat, because the light coming in here onto the chip, you can have mirrors here to sort of make it more efficient at the back. You can have mirrors and angles at the back, but coming down here, the light coming down, touching the cells, creates the voltage. But at the same time, from the energy vector in the pyramid coming in, because that's where the box is situated, it's on the energy vector, these thickness of these plates are going to absorb more energy and also allow the energy to run through the system. The fusion between energy and electricity here, basically both running down the same track, the copper wires. So basically that's what it is. Basically it has three different modes, two different modes basically. So yeah, it's just a solar cell or like a germanium diode, but it's more efficient. Doesn't just pick up light, it picks up energy as well, hence the thickness of the chips, and that all has to be calculated out later on. And there has to be heaps in series. There's like at least 500 or 600 or 700 chips in series to get that voltage, 260 volts. And there might be a resistance issue with that, but that all has to be sorted out basically. There's no other way to do it, pretty much. It needs to be done correctly. So basically the box can't be too big. Yeah, as I explained before, as soon as the electricity arcs, the energy can arc as well, because it's in the same stream. I'll just draw it simply, two inputs and going around the circuit. So light, energy, together, they work together. Now what happens is, once this system started, once the pyramid started, and it's moved to the second track, which we explained, and it's vortexing, and it's really starting to gain potential, this box is going to restrict the whole system, because it's the highest resistance in the system, and it's going to really start to cause problems. So what happens is, when the pyramid starts to really work and you're at the second phase where you're just running this track, you have to bypass the box completely with some kind of relay system. That's easy to set up, but basically you have to bypass it with having like some kind of relay system, so that you can change the tracks and just completely bypass it. So it's no longer required, pretty much. It's done its job, and the engine started, and it's just, the energy is going to just run through this track because it is least resistance, and all that's going to be freed up. So the system is literally, there's no resistance really in the whole system, just a bit in the coils and a bit in the wire. That's it. The beginning and the end here, the gaps between here and here are the beginning and the end of the circuit when it's running. And yeah, this is all just bypassed electrically. So that's pretty much the what the box does, and I think I've covered everything. It's what else? Yeah, I've really covered it. I think it's quite simple in understanding how it works, but it must be configured right, and namely you have it as, it's like electrically, it's like, and energetically. I mean, what it does is it starts the pyramid. That's what it does. There's not enough energy naturally to jump from here to here. You need to give it a boost, and it needs to be in that direction as a diode. So number one, it's a diode. Number two, what it also is a photo cell or a solar panel. Number three, it's an energy cell. This process happens in the fourth dimension. This process happens in the third dimension. This process happens in both. It's the same law as the quartz. Two different processes with one convergence. It's sort of like universal almost. It keeps showing up, that pattern. But yeah, basically that's what it is. And its function is to start the system flowing. You need it to start it up. You need to jump across. And remember, the current's not an issue, it's just the voltage, because that voltage jumping from here to here is going to offer a small little stream for the energy to pass through, and alongside that plasmic discharge, which is constant because it's DC, and provided you're shining light at it, and that energy has the pathway it needs to build up more and more and more, and as it's jumping from the omega ring to the alpha, it's only a little stream of voltage to start with, and as its energy's building up, it becomes thicker and thicker and more dense, because that's not the voltage anymore, it's the energy, because it's been given a path, and as it travels more and more, it builds up more and more, and eventually the voltage becomes obsolete and useless to the design, because you've got this big current passing through it, and this etheric current, and that's when you bypass the box electrically, just with copper wire and a relay, and the whole system can just do its own thing. And the box has served its function as this sort of like a starter motor in a car.